Welcome everybody. My name is Colleen Gregerson. I am the Executive Director for Battery Powered here at the Battery, our philanthropic program at the Battery. And tonight we are really pleased to be bringing you all a conversation with District Attorney Chesa Boudin. While we certainly didn't plan it this way, I think this is a really powerful conversation for us to be having on this day. As you all probably know by now, today Derek Chauvin was found guilty of murdering George Floyd. And it's frankly heartbreaking to think that it took the loss of Mr. Floyd's life in such a public and shocking way for our country to have this long overdue reckoning with racism that his death spurred and inspired. And as I thought about this today, I just hope that George Floyd is looking down on our country today and seeing how very much his Black life mattered and that all Black lives matter. So on that note, it really does please me that our community is going to have such a relevant and timely conversation with our current district attorney. It's a conversation that is, some of my favorite conversations that we have at the Battery are exactly like this. I deeply appreciate that our community can have conversations about challenging topics, that we can have conversations where we don't all agree with each other. And we can have conversations where we see things from other people's perspectives, because that's where I really believe that progress is possible. And that's why I'm so proud and honored to be a part of this community that's willing to do this, and why I'm excited to have this conversation tonight. So we are aiming for an engaged and frank conversation. And yes, there will be plenty of opportunity to ask questions. Just a few pieces of housekeeping. We're all very familiar with the Zoom webinar by now. We're about a year into this. So we are in webinar mode. We can't see or hear our lovely audience, but don't worry, there will be Q&A. So we encourage you throughout the conversation tonight, when you have a question that pops up, please use the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of Zoom. There's also a chat function available. Feel free to put reactions or information in there, but we do ask for respectful dialogue in the chat. We don't all have to agree with one another, but we can agree to be civil and respectful and to respect the diversity of opinion and perspective that's evident in our membership. So with that, I'm really pleased to just do a very brief introduction of our folks here tonight, our speakers here tonight. It's my honor to introduce District Attorney Chesa Boudin. Just a little bit on his background. You all probably know quite a lot about him already. He was a Rhodes Scholar, graduated from Yale Law School, worked as a law clerk to the Honorable Margaret McEwen on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and later for the Honorable Charles Breyer on the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. District Attorney Boudin then worked as a public defender in San Francisco, where he helped lead the office's bail reform unit, and he was elected to his current role in November of 2019. And leading the conversation with the district attorney tonight, we have Eldra Jackson. He is the co-executive director of Inside Circle, a nonprofit organization that has created an amazing healing community for those inside and outside of adult and juvenile prisons. Their work has lowered recidivism rates and built social emotional literacy for those returning to society after incarceration. Inside Circle is also a recipient of a Battery Powered grant. Very proud to be supporting their work. Eldra was an inmate at New Folsom Prison when he found Inside Circle and began the interpersonal journey that eventually led to his release in 2014 and his current leadership role with Inside Circle. He also leads a fabulous podcast called the Inside Circle Podcast, which I highly recommend. So it is my pleasure to turn this conversation over to you, Eldra, to lead us through our discussion tonight.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Colleen, and everyone here who is participating, and you, Mr. Boudin. I have quite a few questions that I would like to ask you, but in light of today's events, I would like to start with this particular question. As a Black man who has experienced the justice system myself, I am interested in how we move to a place of greater balance and equity within the system. Perhaps you could speak specifically to your bail reform work, and in light of heightened awareness around current events, how do we begin to address police misconduct in general, and specifically when so much that is publicized feels racially motivated due to historically criminalizing certain groups?
Well, first of all, let me thank you all for being here. Thank you, Eldra, for moderating the conversation, and thanks to the Battery for hosting us. I know we all wish we could do this in person. It's such a great space, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again soon in person. You know, your question, I think, touches on two really big kind of topics that we could spend hours talking about. One is police accountability, and the other is bail reform as part of a broader conversation around racial justice. So let me start with the first one on police accountability, right? We saw what happens when prosecutors have the courage to file charges, present evidence against police who unlawfully take human life. But let's not forget how unique the circumstances in the George Floyd case are, right? Yes, there was a guilty verdict today on all charges, but even during the time that this case has been in trial, that during the month or so that evidence has been presented to the jury, 60 people across the country were killed at the hands of police. That's about 2 a day. So this verdict, the trial, the charges don't change the very dire circumstances that we all live with when it comes to police accountability, when it comes to the relationships between communities of color and law enforcement. The other thing that's really unique about the George Floyd trial, and that's important we remember and not let the outcome of this case shape our perception of the broader system, is that this case never would have been filed but for a massive national protest movement, right? And that movement was only possible because, first of all, there was a video showing the horrific crime in great detail. That doesn't always exist in police use of force cases. And because of a tremendous amount of groundwork that the Black Lives Matter movement had done over years in advance of this moment. And finally, the verdict was only possible in part because of the testimony of the chief of police. Now, it is exceedingly rare for a chief of police to take the stand and testify against one of his or her own officers. We simply don't see that in most cases involving police use of force. So we have a lot of work to do in San Francisco, in California, and across the country, so that what happened here, A, never happens again, and B, if it does happen, the outcome is normal instead of the subject of national anxiety, right? If a police officer does what happened to George Floyd, this outcome should be normal and should be expected. It shouldn't require a national protest movement. It shouldn't require, kind of national attention to get the outcome that justice requires. Now, just to give you one example of something that we've done since I took office in this space, we filed 3 separate criminal cases against San Francisco police officers who used what we believe to be unlawful force against unarmed Black men while in uniform. One of those cases is the first ever homicide charges against an on-duty San Francisco Police Department officer. And because we recognize how difficult it is to overcome legal and procedural hurdles to police accountability, today, as the George Floyd verdict was being read in Minnesota, I was testifying in front of the California State Assembly in support of Assembly Bill 127, which I'm proud to co-sponsor, which would eliminate some of the procedural hurdles to filing criminal charges against police who break the law. Now, that's just a couple examples. We could spend the whole evening talking about the challenges and the obstacles to really meaningfully holding police accountable in ways that enforce the law equally. But you also asked about bail reform. So I want to touch on that. For folks who aren't familiar with money bail, the basic way that it works is as follows. Someone gets arrested by police, they get taken to jail. If they have money, they can buy their way out regardless of how serious the charges are or how strong the evidence against them. If they don't have money, then regardless of how weak the evidence or how trivial the charges, they languish behind bars, sometimes for months, awaiting trial. Now, there's 2 fundamental problems with the money bail system. The first one is it undermines public safety by allowing wealthy people who are dangerous to buy their way out. The second problem with money bail is it undermines the promise of equal protection under law by discriminating against people who are poor. So when I took office, one of my very first policies was to replace a wealth-based system with a risk-based system. In San Francisco's district attorney's office, on my watch, my prosecutors are not allowed to ask for money bail. Instead, if we believe someone is too dangerous to be released, we ask the court to hold them without bail, meaning they're detained pending trial. If we think there are some conditions that can protect the public and allow them to be released, then we ask the court to impose those conditions, but it has nothing to do with how much money they have in the bank account. Now, these are policies that are controversial to some only because they believe that everyone should be detained pre-trial or because they believe in a system that discriminates. If you look at the data, then you know that putting a price tag on freedom doesn't make any of us safer, and it doesn't promote the values that our country was founded on. I'm proud to say that other jurisdictions around the country are following our lead in eliminating cash bail. Chittenden County, Vermont, for example, other jurisdictions within California. And in fact, there was a Senate Bill 10 a few years ago that would have eliminated cash bail across the state. This is the direction the state is moving because public safety requires it and equal protection of law demands it. Now, we have some situations still where a judge may set bail over our objection and a defendant may be able to post that bail and get out. My view is that undermines public safety. We have some cases where in other counties where someone charged with a misdemeanor with no criminal history can't afford bail and ends up losing their job, losing their housing, losing custody of their kids. That undermines public safety. So we've got to go towards a system, as we've done in San Francisco, where we focus on risk rather than wealth. And we know that there are really significant racial implications for these policies. The Treasurer's Office, the San Francisco Treasurer did a report, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, that showed that almost all of the non-refundable payments being made to bail bond companies were coming from just a couple zip codes in San Francisco. And most of those payments were being made by Black and brown women. We've got to stop siphoning money away from poor communities, from women of color, and start focusing on risk-based policies rather than wealth.
Thank you for that. And before we get too far away from this, because I know people would be interested, we're speaking about bail reform, and that's one of your more high-profile and controversial policies, for some people. And what I would ask is, how is this impacting the community? Public safety. What impact is this having on San Francisco?
Well, I think it's having a good impact. You look at the crime data, you look at the statistics. I know that the public perception is really disconnected from data in this space because of the unusual year we're living through. But overall crime in San Francisco is down by over 20% since I took office. Things like auto burglaries and other thefts have fallen by more than 40%. Robberies down by about 20%, assaults down by about 10%. We've seen an unprecedented decline in crime in virtually every category. And there's a couple categories of crime that have gone up, like residential and commercial burglaries, like car thefts. But overall, rape is down 40% this year compared to last year. A massive decline in crime. And part of it is that instead of relying on wealth as a proxy for detention, we're taking the time to do the analysis and decide this person is too dangerous to be released. And we ask the court to detain them with no bail. And in other cases, we're allowing people to be released with appropriate supervision conditions, like drug counseling or mental health therapy, things that can actually protect the public while they're out and avoid a future crime or recidivism. So overall, we're seeing really positive results, and it's why the entire state is moving in the same direction that we're leading.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And at Inside Circle, we understand that childhood experiences shape us all to some degree or another. And there are folks who might look at you simply as a politician and the district attorney, and I look at it as, that's a vocation, that's what you do, it's not who you are. So to understand a little bit more about your background, can you share a bit about your childhood and how that informs your approach to policy?
Absolutely. And before I do that, Eldra, let me just put in the link, a link in the chat for everybody who's with us, just so they can see where I'm getting those statistics from. It's a police crime dashboard, and you can look at all different categories of crime, compare this year to last year, 2020 to 2019, et cetera.
Thank
But
you.
you asked about my child. You know, the United States leads the world in locking people up. It's not something we should be proud of. We incarcerate more people than any other country on the planet. With about 4% of the world's population, we have well over 20% of the world's prisoners. And it's not making us safer, it's not working. It's such a widespread and common part of the American experience. It's really come in some ways to define American culture. Look, the majority of adults in this country, the majority, have an immediate family member who is either currently or formerly incarcerated, right? And I'm one of them. When I was a year old, my parents left me at the babysitter. They never came back to get me. That day, while I was playing with a babysitter, my parents drove the getaway car in an armed robbery that went tragically wrong. A security guard was shot and killed. 2 police officers were shot and killed. Even though my parents were unarmed, they were both involved in the crime. They were both arrested that day. My mother ended up serving 22 years in prison. My father was sentenced to a minimum of 75 years. He may never get out. He's still in prison 39 years later. Now, I don't remember my parents' arrest. I don't remember their sentence. My earliest memories are going through steel gates and metal detectors just to see them, just to give them a hug. And as soon as I can remember thinking about these issues, I remember noticing that most of the other people in the lines to get into those prison visiting rooms didn't look like me. They were Black and brown women and children. Our addiction to incarceration as a primary response to a tremendously diverse array of social problems, from mental illness to poverty to drug addiction to housing, has not only bankrupted local and state governments and starved us of the kinds of resources we need to invest in strong, healthy, vibrant communities, but it's also torn families apart and created an intergenerational cycle of incarceration that makes us less safe, that ensures kids will grow up without their parents, that ensures there will be future crime and crime victims. It's one of the reasons, the experience I had growing up visiting prison and seeing the detrimental impact on the next generation is one of the reasons that one of my very first policies when I took office in 2020 was to create a primary caregiver diversion program, because I believe that we are all safer when parents are at home taking care of their kids instead of in cages. And so we want to encourage parents to be at home and to have the skills they need to protect and to care for their children. Those kinds of policies can break the intergenerational cycle of incarceration. They can make us safer, and they can save resources to invest in healthcare and education and housing and jobs and drug treatment, and the things that actually make us safe in the long term.
Thank you for that. There's an old saying, you don't fight City Hall. And so I'm wondering, what are some of the greatest challenges that you face in trying to increase collaboration with other city agencies in the face of budgetary constraints and obstacles that are structural? They've been there, for as long as mankind has, been here.
Like you said, there's an old saying. There's another saying that politics is a team sport. And, folks want their team to win. It doesn't matter about the substance or the policy. It's all about politics. That's not who I am. That's not why I ran for office. That's not my background. I wasn't in politics before I ran. I'm in this because my entire life has been shaped by this country's approach to criminal justice. I'm in this because I saw the failings of our criminal justice system from day one. I saw the ways that we use victims as little more than pieces of evidence and fail to support and heal and invest in meeting the needs of people who've been harmed by crime. I saw the way that our warehousing of human beings in cages on a scale never before seen by humankind is actually making us less safe. I saw the ways in which we're distracted from the root causes of crime and instead focus on punitive, retributive approaches. And I'm in this because I want to do work that allows San Francisco to move forward as the safest, healthiest, most just city in the country. And I believe we can do it. I believe we can do it if we put the politics aside and focus on data, on evidence, on humanity, and on policies that we know will actually address the root causes of crime. Let me be clear. 75% of people booked into San Francisco County Jail in any given year are drug addicted, mentally ill, or both. We know what is driving crime. We know what is driving the issues that make us feel unsafe. Now we need City Hall to step up and address those issues. We need treatment on demand for people who are suffering from addiction or mental illness. We need universal access to mental health care for people who are living on our streets. Those are the kinds of policies. They don't come from the district attorney's office or the police department. They come from City Hall. And if we put our money where our mouth is when it comes to public safety, we won't need as many criminal court cases. We won't need as many prosecutors or police officers. We'll have more social workers, more drug treatment beds, and we'll all be safer and more prosperous as a result.
What have you learned over the course of the last year that would have served you had you known that going into office?
How long do you have? We got a lot of stuff to talk about. It's been a steep learning curve. Look, Eldra, I'd never been in public office. I'd never been a prosecutor. So I've learned everything from, look, I presented a case to a grand jury, a murder case. I'd never presented evidence to a grand jury before. I was able to personally take an old murder case that had been languishing for years, since before I was in office, present the evidence to the grand jury, secure an indictment, and move that case closer to trial. In terms of navigating the budget, City Hall politics, I've learned a tremendous amount about some of the obstacles, just basic things that shouldn't be a problem in a city like San Francisco. Things about, how difficult it is to simply keep my office fully staffed, things about how difficult it is to get other city agencies to play the role we need them to play around issues, whether it be public health or law enforcement. We've all got to work together, and there's a lot of gaps in communication. And so I wish going into it, I'd had a better appreciation for some of those disconnects, between the various departments that do this work, because those are real, and they affect public safety, they affect the outcomes of individual cases, and they affect our ability to respond effectively to and support people who've been harmed by crime.
What is your most ambitious goal for the next year, and what has to happen to see that become a reality?
My most ambitious goal is to make sure that my office has the resources to support every person harmed by crime in San Francisco. The overwhelming majority of the money that goes into my victim services team is from grants. We get virtually no funding from the city to actually do victim services. When I took office, we had a single Chinese-speaking victim advocate for all of the Chinese-speaking crime victims in the city of San Francisco. It's not enough. Now, I'm proud that I've hired a second victim service advocate who speaks Chinese and a new assistant district attorney who speaks Chinese. But we need more. We need language access for every language group in this city. We need enough victim advocates that we can respond not just to violent crimes, but also to victims of property crime. That's something that's never been done in San Francisco. And I would love to see a district attorney's office in a city in partnership with community-based organizations, with other city agencies, where as soon as a crime is committed, even if the police don't make an arrest immediately, even if my office can't successfully prosecute that case, where we're reaching out to victims and finding ways to help them recover and navigate the complex legal system. That's something that's a long way off, but I would love to see it happen. And it is the primary request in my budget proposal to the mayor and the board of supervisors this year. My primary request is a dramatic expansion of victim services.
Victim services. I've got one more question for you, and then I want to get to some Q&A from the folks who are attending this, so that we can hear from them and have you answer those questions. And the last question that I have for you is a little bit of self-promotion, because at Inside Circle, we champion the mantra that hurt people and healed people heal people. I've heard you speak to this fact as well. And we have a proven track record of work both inside and outside of institutions that supports healing trauma. We know that unaddressed trauma underlines much of what contributes to individuals rationalizing the actions that end up being prosecuted as crimes. As with you being an advocate for greater public safety and successful reentry and trauma healing, how do you incorporate that with restorative justice?
Well, nothing wrong with a little self-promotion now and then. You plugged your podcast in the beginning, so I'm going to take this opportunity to let folks know we have a podcast in the district attorney's office called Chasing Justice. Season 1 was in 2020. We're getting ready to launch season 2. So check that out as well if you're into podcasts. To your question, Eldra, about hurt people hurting people, we know that's true, right? There's massive amounts of empirical evidence showing us that people who cause harm have mostly been harmed. And we see that every day in my work, right? I think for a lot of folks, there's this image that you've got bad people on one side who commit crimes, and then good people on the other side who are victimized by crimes. And in reality, there's a whole lot going on in the middle. We know that. My victim services team provided support to approximately 8,000 victims of crime in the last year who had themselves been prosecuted at some point, right? People who have a criminal history, who've caused harm to others, and vice versa. Sometimes somebody being prosecuted in one courtroom is receiving victim services in the next courtroom, right? There's a lot of overlap between the people who are traumatized by crime and who go on to cause violent crime. And so to your point, Eldra, we have to break that cycle. We have to do it in a couple of ways. One is by recognizing the complexity of the people that we are prosecuting, that our system is interacting with, by remembering the humanity of crime victims. They're more than just a piece of evidence. They're more than just a soundbite to secure a conviction. And also remembering the complexity and the nuance and the humanity of the people we prosecute, the people who have families, who come from communities, who have hopes and dreams, and who will someday be released from custody. And we need them to be released with the support and the skills and the supervision that's going to keep all of us safe and prevent them from being rearrested. Right? That's not what our system is doing today. We are not providing services or rehabilitative programs. Look, the state prison system in California, which is bankrupting our state government, spends less than 2% of its budget, less than 2% of its many billions of dollars on programming for people who are in prison. We know folks are going to get released. We need them to get released with the circumstances and the supports to prevent future crime. And we're not doing a good enough job. We've got a tremendous amount of room for improvement in that area. And I think your message, Eldra, hurt people, is a critical place to start.
Agreed. Now, what I'm going to do is get the hell out of the way and start reading questions. Colleen, you want to handle this piece?
I can help with this. There's a lot of stuff coming in, so we can tag team this, Eldra. I've pulled out a few questions to start with. If you want to start looking through all the great questions we're getting.
Yeah, I do want to start with this one from an anonymous attendee. And this is to you, Mr. Boudin. Are you concerned at all about the number of San Francisco residents that are moving out of the city permanently, especially in the last 14 months because of crime and the homeless problem? These moves are not related to COVID.
Well, we want people to live in San Francisco. We want people to stay here. We want people to come here. I think it's a city that we all call home for good reason. It's a world-class city, and it's going to continue to be. I think the reality is, as you can look at the data that I just shared with you from the police department, crime is actually down. So I don't think that's why people are leaving the city. People may have individual negative experiences, but overall, crime is down by historic margins. It's down by double digits. And that's what we know empirically. You can read it in the San Francisco Chronicle. You can look at the police department crime dashboard. But COVID has had a devastating impact, not just on the the way we live our lives, the way we do our jobs, but it's also impacted the way that we perceive the world around us. Right? Most of us aren't leaving our house. In fact, there was an article I think in the New York Times yesterday showing that San Francisco is the city in the country that has people spending the most time at home compared to before the pandemic, right? The most time. San Franciscans, more than any other city, are living at home. And that means we're not interacting with the rest of the city the way we usually do. And it means when we do interact with the rest of the city, we might be the only ones on the street. We're going out into neighborhoods that used to be hustling and bustling with tourists and with people at restaurants and shopping and doing errands and going to or coming from work. And now it's just us and the folks on the street that don't have a home to go to. And that feels less safe. It feels less secure. It feels like crime is up. But you don't need to take my word for it. Look at the police department data. This isn't my data. This is what the police department, the San Francisco Police Department, I see there's a request for the link again. So I'm going to include it in the chat again. And this will show you this isn't about crimes we prosecute, to be clear. This is crimes that get reported to police. Now, we can't prosecute a crime until and unless police make an arrest. And as has been true historically, police in San Francisco make arrests in about 10% of reported crime. That means about 90% of the time when someone commits a crime and it gets reported, there's no arrest. Again, that's from police department data. I'm putting another link in the chat so that folks can see how this works. This isn't a criticism of the police. I want to be clear. This is true historically. Most reported crimes across the country don't result in an arrest. If they don't result in an arrest, they can't result in a crime being prosecuted. But my office has filed over 5,000 new criminal cases against adults since I took office. Despite court closures, despite a historic drop in crime and a new arrest brought to us, we filed over 5,000 new cases. In fact, just today, we secured a guilty verdict in the first misdemeanor jury trial that the court has allowed us to conduct since March of 2020. We want to do more trials. I've got lawyers going into the courtroom every day and telling judges, Your Honor, I'm ready for trial. But the courts have shut down. They haven't called juries in. We only have 4 courtrooms at the criminal courthouse that are open for jury trials right now. 2 of them have a murder being prosecuted. 1 of them has a domestic violence attempted murder, and the other just finished an assault with a knife trial. Those are the kinds of cases we're prioritizing, serious and violent cases. That was my promise to voters, that I would prioritize those kinds of cases, and that's exactly what we're doing. San Francisco continues to be one of the safest cities in the region. You look at the homicide rate in Oakland, for example, it's up over 200% this year. In San Francisco, our homicide rate is down compared to last year, year to date. Now, every homicide is one too many, but San Francisco continues to be and will be one of the safest cities in the region.
So there's a question in the Q&A that I want to get to about, I believe it's about Prop 47. And the question is, can you speak to the $1,000 threshold on prosecuting property and commercial crimes? I believe these types of crimes have increased. That's a belief from our attendee. You can say whether the data is showing that. Is this perhaps as a result of that policy?
Sure. So let me clarify, and thank you for the question. Really important. There's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. So first of all, this is not a policy. This is a state law passed by the voters of the state of California several years ago. Overall crime has declined since Proposition 47 took effect. Also, it's not a $1,000 limit, it's a $950 threshold for certain categories of thefts. And let me be very clear, that threshold does not apply. In other words, the dollar value has no significance to whether we charge an auto burglary as a felony, a residential burglary, always a felony, a robbery, always a felony. And in San Francisco, in the last year, comparing the first 4 months of 2020 to the first 4 months of 2021, overall theft crimes, the kind of crimes that are governed by this law, Proposition 47, have declined by 34.7%. You can see that statistic in the link that I provided you. Overall, last year, if you look at 2020 as a year compared to 2019, overall theft crimes were down by approximately 40%. So no, I don't believe that this law is contributing to an increase in crime. The data shows just the opposite in San Francisco and across the state of California.
Thank you. Another question, well, we've seen a number of questions come in around drug use, drug dealing, and around fentanyl, the increase in fentanyl overdoses that has tragically been happening across our city and in other places, particularly over the past year. What are your plans for how to address that, both from the perspective of those who are distributing it, putting it onto the streets illegally, and also from the perspective of those who are addicted and how we get them treatment and services to treat their addiction?
Well, first of all, the fentanyl crisis is devastating. People are dying every day at higher rates from fentanyl overdoses than of COVID-19 in San Francisco. This is a trend that started well before I was elected, and it's continued, sadly, in the last year. It's true not just in San Francisco, but across the country as fentanyl becomes more readily available, purer, and as people, in the context of the pandemic, have begun consuming these deadly drugs in private and in isolation instead of in groups where someone can intervene when there's an overdose. I want to be clear about our approach to drugs and drug crimes. My office, since I was sworn in, has filed felony charges in about 80% of the drug cases police bring us. Police bring us felony arrests, we file charges in about 80% of those cases. It's not effective. We're all clear it's not effective. You look at the Tenderloin, you look at Soma, we know it's not working for the same reasons that the war on drugs has failed all across this country since inception. As long as there are people who are willing to buy drugs to feed their addiction, there will be people who take the risk to sell those drugs. We see that in San Francisco, we see it across the country. We're prosecuting the cases as fast as the police bring them to us, but it's not making a difference for reasons we can all appreciate. The people who sell drugs are willing to take risks to make money. The people who buy drugs have devastating addictions, and we need a more effective public health approach. Now, I want to give you numbers. In 2020, the police brought my office 680 felony drug arrests. 680. We filed new criminal charges in 533 of those cases, okay? 78.38%. But it hasn't made a difference on the streets of the Tenderloin. Does anybody here really think that 600 arrests, no matter what we do with those people, that 600 arrests in a year in a city like San Francisco for something like drug dealing is going to change the face of the Tenderloin and Soma? Of course it's not. And if anybody here thinks that the solution is simply tougher prosecution, look at what happened when the U.S. attorney stepped in, both in 2019 and again in 2020. The U.S. attorney stepped in, took dozens of cases all at once, and everybody he prosecuted was deported. Forget prison, forget jail, they were deported. Did it make one iota of difference in terms of the availability, the purity, or the cost of drugs on the streets of the Tenderloin? Did it decrease in any way the number of people dying of overdoses? Of course it didn't, because we're not investing in effective public health interventions that can save lives, prevent overdoses, and help people move away from these devastating addictions. Now, there's a role for law enforcement, but it should be upstream. It should be getting serious suppliers upstream in the supply chain, not focusing on street level arrests. San Francisco Police Department spends over $13,000 per buy-bust drug arrest. We have limited resources and we need to use them more effectively and more efficiently. That's why I proposed in my budget this year, I'm asking City Hall to give me the resources to launch a fentanyl task force so that we can play a leadership role in helping to promote the public health interventions that are necessary to save lives and direct resources on the law enforcement side upstream. So we're not simply wasting resources, cycling people on and off the same corners, but instead actually making a difference in the supply of fentanyl that we're going to get off the streets.
I've got a question for you here, and I don't want to butcher the name, so I'll just read the question. The metrics for success emphasized by our society in criminal justice are stacked heavily against progressive reform. Even policies that benefit vastly more people than they harm can easily be construed in a negative light because of the lens through which we observe them. How do you build a movement and encourage other DAs to follow your lead when the way your policies are assessed makes it almost impossible to cite the numbers to your benefit?
Well, look, I mean, it's a deep, complicated question. How we measure the success of district attorneys and of our office, of our individual attorneys, is a big question, and there's no easy answer to it. The traditional metrics, the metrics that a lot of offices across the country that believe in tough on crime policies use, are things like conviction rates, length of sentences, right? Charging rates. those are things that have a lot to do with politics and with perception and very little to do with public safety. Personally, the way I look at it is we have to do the work, no matter how difficult, no matter how challenging, of intervening in every single arrest in a way that gets people off the street and on their feet, in a way that prevents and disrupts the cycle of recidivism. And that looks different in different cases. But I'll tell you, I would rather see someone successfully complete a diversion program that leads them to sobriety and stable housing than suffer a conviction for shoplifting and then be right back on the street in the same circumstances they were in that led them to shoplift in the first place. That will drive down our conviction rates. It will make people, give people ammunition to criticize me and my office. And it's a hard thing to measure because, as you can all see from the chat here, the perception in San Francisco today is that crime is up. And the reality is the opposite. Yes, there are certain categories of crime that are up, and they're serious, and we take them seriously. Crimes like commercial and residential burglary are up by double digits. Now, that's not a result of our policies any more than it's a result of our policies that other categories of crime are down by double digits. We're living through unprecedented times. The number of people who are unemployed in the state of California today is double the number that were unemployed a year ago. So is it any surprise that there's an increase in some kinds of property crime like residential burglary, commercial burglary? It's not a surprise. And if you look at the police clearance rate, police are having a hard time keeping up with it. They're doing their best, they're working hard, but everybody's wearing masks. Makes it a lot harder to solve a crime, right? So police are only making arrests in about 8% of reported residential burglaries. Now that's a massive decline from what they were doing in the beginning of last year. Last year, they were making arrests in about 13% of reported burglaries. Now it's down to 9%, right? And you can see that in the police dashboard I put in the link. These are problems and challenges that we face collectively. They're not the result of one policy. They're the result of a seismic shift in how we live our lives across the planet. And as we reopen, as we go back to a normal San Francisco, we're going to see tourism return. We're going to see the hustle and bustle of our neighborhoods return. We're going to feel safer, even as auto burglaries and shoplifting go back up, even as residential burglaries start to go down. Those are trends that have far less to do with any policing or prosecution policy and far more to do with the demographics and economics of a COVID pandemic.
Thanks for that. I wanted to just press like one step further on that, because it does seem that the perception versus the data is significantly different, right? But perception is also important, right? Like that affects how people behave. It affects how people act, and it affects how people vote, even if the perception doesn't always align with what the data is saying. So how do we kind of address this so that we can all kind of come at these issues that we all care about, that we all want to solve and we all want to improve, from a place of a common understanding rather than perceptions that maybe are vastly divergent from fact?
Well, the first thing, and we have to do this in our policies, right? So this is something that I say as much for me and my staff as for the folks in the audience. We've got to make sure that we're driving our decisions based on data and empirical evidence, not just based on fear. Right? There's so much misinformation, disinformation. We're also overwhelmed with headlines and tweets and next door posts. It's really easy to have our perceptions or our decisions driven by impartial, imperfect, inaccurate information. And so I would just urge you, when you think about the kind of city you want to live in, when you think about the kind of policies that you want me as your elected district attorney to implement, don't you want them to be based on data? Don't you want them to be driven by academic research and empirical evidence rather than by a outlier high profile crime that doesn't represent the norm, but is a deviation from the standard procedure? We should not, in any area of policy, criminal justice or otherwise, we should not be making policy based on the exceptional, unusual outliers. We should be focusing our policy on the bread and butter, on the things we see every day, right? The thousands of cases that my office has charged, that some of you, judging by the chat, aren't aware were even prosecuted, right? 5,000 new criminal cases initiated since I took office. Criminal conviction in a jury trial today that doesn't make the headlines, right? It doesn't make the headlines because it's the norm. It's what people expect us to do. What makes the headlines, and all too often, what captures people's imagination or understanding of what's happening, rather than the norm, it's the outlier. It's when things go wrong. It's when a mistake is made. It's when something is sensational enough to be reported in the headlines. And we cannot allow ourselves to make policy based on those outliers. We are smart enough. We are informed enough. As a city, we have access to information. Do the research. Look into the information. Read the full article, not just the headline. And when in doubt, reach out to us. We'll provide you with information. We want to hear from you. We want your ideas. We want your critical feedback. And we want to work together to make San Francisco a safer place.
To that note, when you speak about the outliers, because, you know, if it bleeds, it leads. And those are the things that catch people's attention. Those are the things that catch voters' attention and contributes to feelings of not being safe. And I'm watching the chat and seeing a lot of questions. So I'd like to give you an opportunity here to speak to the Troy Mcallister case, because a lot of people are asking about that. And those are the sorts of outliers. Those are the sorts of things that are publicized, and people hear that and they're like, what the hell is he doing?
Troy Mcallister case is one that I lose sleep over all the time. You know, I lay awake at night thinking about what we could have done differently that would have saved the lives of those two women. You know, I met with both their families. You know, I met with Mrs. Abe. I met with Elizabeth Platt's sister and brother. I'll never forget those conversations. It was devastating, horrific, unnecessary, and, you know, loss that we can't undo no matter what prosecution approach we take. And so when something like that happens, anytime there's a serious crime, we look back and we say, was the person in our custody? Did we have a chance to do something different? What could we have done differently? How could we have intervened in a way that would have prevented this? And the easy answer in every case is if we'd only kept them in jail longer, this wouldn't have happened. It's an easy shortcut, but it's a shortcut that leads us down a very dangerous path. It leads us to mass incarceration. It leads us to saying Black lives don't matter, that anytime someone gets arrested, we're going to put them in jail forever. We don't have the resources, we don't have the laws, and we certainly don't have the values in a place like San Francisco to allow us to do that. And so instead, we have to analyze, were mistakes made? What should have happened differently? If we had done something differently, would it have prevented this outcome? You know, a lot of folks have focused on the fact that Troy Mcallister was arrested a number of times and that we didn't file new criminal charges against him. But I want to be really clear. The things he was arrested for would not have resulted in his pretrial detention, even had we filed charges. That's not how the law works. There's a presumption of innocence. If you're charged with a non-violent offense, like being in possession of a stolen car, the Constitution guarantees you release in most circumstances. So a lot of folks have narrowed in on this idea that, well, if only, and I think about this, if only my charging deputies, they've got 100 years of experience between them. These are folks who look at hundreds of cases a day and make charging decisions. Sometimes we file criminal charges. Sometimes we ask the police to do more research, more investigation, and bring it back to us. Sometimes we decide we're going to refer the case to another agency, parole or probation or a different county. This is the thing, this is the bread and butter of what my charging team does every single day. And none of their cases, none of their decisions have been scrutinized with the level of intensity that the Troy Mcallister case has. I looked at it myself, every single decision point. What could we have done differently? Well, yes, we could have charged him instead of referring him to his parole officer. We could have done that, but that would not have prevented this tragedy any more than referring him to parole prevented this tragedy. Troy Mcallister was in jail for 5 years. He was in jail for 5 years. The maximum term on robbery under California law. And in those 5 years, we clearly did not do an adequate job of getting at whatever it is that drove him to commit crime after crime after crime. Collectively, we failed. Now, he was in jail before I was elected, right? And we had the opportunity during a 5-year period. And we looked at what he was doing in jail. We believed that he wouldn't commit crimes when he was released. He earned his GED. He was engaging in programming in the jail. He was in a trusted position working in the jail, Sheriff's department put him in a trusted position, working with knives in the kitchen. So we had reason to believe that he had beaten his addiction, but clearly he had not. And the outcome is devastating. It is absolutely devastating. My job every day is to make decisions with imperfect information and with very high stakes. High stakes for the people we prosecute. We hold them in jail pending trial. They lose their jobs, their families, custody of their kids, and they may be more likely to commit crimes again in the future. And some of those people will never be convicted of a crime. There's also high stakes for all of us in the community. We see that in the Troy Mcallister case. And we will never, ever see the crimes that are prevented. We will never, ever see the families that are maintained intact or the jobs that aren't lost, right? There's no report, there's no way to measure that. And it goes back to Eldra's question about the challenge of measuring the success of the work we do. Crime is down by double digits overall, and folks want to focus in on the categories that have gone up. People on this meeting and many folks across San Francisco believe that crime is up, even though it's down. That's not unique to San Francisco. Across the country over the last 20 years, crime has fallen, and public perception of crime has always been that it's up, because as Eldra said, if it bleeds, it leads. I have to make impossible decisions. That's my job. I wake up every morning humbled by the opportunity to serve the people of the city and county of San Francisco. I know I'll make mistakes, but they won't be for lack of trying, and they will certainly not be for lack of caring about the folks that I am privileged enough to serve.
Well, I know that we have a hard stop at 6:30. So Eldra, I'm going to hand it over to you for final questions before we have to wrap up.
One last question that I would have for you, and I think for the people here in this audience and the people of San Francisco, would be, as briefly and succinctly as you can, how do we keep the people of San Francisco safe?
Fundamentally, we have to invest in attacking root causes of crime. We know what drives crime and lack of safety, and in San Francisco, it's largely mental illness and drug addiction. And we need to be effective in partnering with law enforcement and with public health officials so that every time a crime gets reported, it results in effective intervention. Intervention that gets at those root causes. 75% of people brought to the county jail in San Francisco are drug addicted, mentally ill, or both. And until we address those root causes, whether through incarceration or whether through treatment programs, court mandated, parole, probation, we need to work together with the mayor, with the board of supervisors, with the chief of police, with the chief of adult probation, so that our interventions are focusing on the kinds of issues that drive criminal behavior. That's how we break the cycle. That's how we build safety. That's how we get people who are on the streets on their feet. And it's how we build a safe and secure and healthy community that reflects all of our values as San Franciscans.
Thank you very much, sir. I want to honor everybody's time, and I'm putting it out there, man. I'm sending an invite out to you. I need you to come on to the Inside Circle podcast.
Send me an email. I'll be there. Absolutely. Are you kidding? Send me an email. I'll be happy to do it.
All right.
Well, I want to thank Eldra. Thank you so much for leading this discussion tonight. We are always enlightened by your thinking and your questions. Chesa, thank you very much for joining us tonight and sharing your thoughts and information with our team here. We know you have a very busy schedule, and we appreciate you being here. To our audience, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for being very active in the chat and in the Q&A. I really apologize that we couldn't get to all the questions. We slammed in as many as we could, but we really do appreciate all of them, and maybe we'll get another chance to bring you on another time and get to more of those questions. But thank you to all, and have a very good evening.